The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
If I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Tuesday, January 1st, 2019. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Ladies and gentlemen, we made it. It's 2019. We're in the future. Oh, my God. Hovercrafts. Little sliding doors where the food comes out. You press a button and it makes it like a completely synthetic meal.
You have Hyperloops now?
Hyperloops. Or as they used to call them, subways.
Pneumatic tubes.
We've got jetpacks. 2019 jetpack, you got to bet.
Well, those ones that you can do on a lake, the lake jetpacks where they squirt
where
water.
They squirt water?
Those are pretty cool. Actually.
Those are pretty cool. Oh, man, 2019 is great. So far, I'm loving it. It's just food tastes different. That much closer to the climate catastrophe.
The new Soylent offerings are good.
So good. Is he still president? I guess I don't know because we're pre-recording this. Hope springs eternal, folks. But we have our final best of the 2018 year, even though it's 2019 now. We're back live tomorrow. Hope you had a good New Year's. Got a bit of a hangover. This is the perfect hangover interview because it's just a fascinating piece of history. We had a bit of a historical theme for the best ofs this year, and I like it. Just you learn something, but you don't have to. You're not disengaging from. They're all relevant to what's going on today, but you don't have to hear about that horrible human being, 365. Today on the program, we have the author, William Hogeland, author of Autumn of the Black Snake, The Creation of the U.S. Army and the Invasion That Opened the West. Fascinating story. I love this one. I referenced this book quite a bit, I feel like.
Yeah.
I referenced all the ones that we had, I think, in terms of the best of this time. But this one really stuck with me. All right, folks. I mean, just a reminder, we have some fun half stuff for you that we're gonna give you for free today. If you want to support this show, go to jointhemajority.com and do so. It is your support that makes the show possible. We will be back live tomorrow, 12 noon Eastern. You can listen to us via the app at majorityapp.com. We got a free app for any type of for iOS or Android. We've got you can watch the show live on YouTube. You can listen to it live on the app, and of course become a member and get that extra content. All right, quick break. When we come back, William Hogeland. We'll see you tomorrow. Happy New Year. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome William Hogeland. He is the author of The Whiskey Rebellion, Founding Finance, the Declaration, and his latest is The Autumn of the Black Snake, the origin story of the American military. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So, okay, you're working with a relatively small amount of time, or I guess is the essence of your book. That is basically the first half of the 1790s, and it is, as you set out, a massive turning point. Of course, is a fairly nascent United States, a massive turning point in the trajectory of the United States. Before we get into the details and some of the characters that we're talking about, why is that?
Well, I think generally the 1790s is probably seen as a big, it's the launch moment, right, of the nation. But what I'm talking about is surprisingly little known in that context, which is that one of the great achievements of the Washington administration, and one of the most, I think, world-changing achievements, was the establishment of a United States Army. Although when I say that, I think it's kind of tricky because people sort of assume there must have always been an army since there was a nation formed, but there wasn't one. And the formation of that army, I think, is a huge benchmark, a huge turning of a wheel in global history, not just U.S. history. And at the same time, it's the beginning of the conquest of the rest of the continent, what became the conquest of the rest of the continent, in that the first war the United States ever fought occurred in the first half of the 1790s, and that's the reason they formed the Army. And that was the war to conquer what is now the upper Midwest, basically, Ohio and et cetera, which begins an entire change in the relations of indigenous people and the United States of America, and so forth. So all of that seems, crucially important to me, and that's why I kind of got into reading about it and writing the book.
I'm going to resist the temptation to jump immediately into which came first, right? The imperialist, I guess the imperialist agenda or the war. I mean the standing army. But before we get there, let's dig into sort of the story. Because it starts essentially, or maybe this is a little bit too late in it, but it is the St. Clair's defeat, which is the, I guess the ostensible impetus. But tell us about who was the argument between prior to this about whether or not the United States should have a standing army, and give us a basic outlines of those arguments.
There was a strong feeling among many Americans, elite and ordinary Americans alike, that in a kind of government that had just been established, the kind of government that actually the revolution had been fought possibly to create, a Republican government, a representative government, that a full-time professional, nationally run, sort of top-down army was just anathema to all of those basic Republican values. I mean, the standing army is a term that was used. It was a term of just abhorrence, basically, among many of the Whig thinkers who had created the ideology around American independence. It was the kind of thing where it's the kind of army that the King of England had, or the King of France had, a professional sort of army used, hirelings of the king, just could be turned against the citizenry at any time, a sign of tyranny, really. That was a pretty widespread opinion, and the idea was then a free people would never have a standing army. A free people would rely on the, volunteer, obligated citizen soldier, the militia. That's a pretty common theme that still continues in American debates about military, actually. I mean, we still romanticize militia. A lot of people in this country do. But there was another point of view, and it was held by some pretty famous people like George Washington and Henry Knox, who became Secretary of War and had been Washington's artillery commander during the Revolution, and of course Alexander Hamilton, and others who had long believed, even during the Revolution, had just been sort of horrified by what they considered the poor performance of the non-professional forces, and really were pushing for more professionalism even during the Revolution. They felt that the only way to really have an effective nationhood would be also to have an effective army, and that army would have to be run. Once you have a nation, it would have to be a nationally, uniformly run, uniformly clothed, like uniformed, and uniformly trained, and so forth. Army that would be ready to react to situations, not have to be raised from the public, kind of at the last minute, and so forth. So that was a big debate, and it was absolutely not fait accompli, politically speaking, that there would ever be a United States Army. So to achieve one, and that's part of what my book's about, the Washington administration had to make some very big moves on the one hand, and sort of backroom moves on the other hand to get that done politically.
Well, and unstated in those two sides of the argument is sort of, it seems to me, like a third option, right? Where it's not just that we need a standing army in the event that we have a sudden need for it. It also, and it's not that we want a standing army to be tyrannical to our own population. There's a certain amount of unspoken. I mean, I guess the siren call is just taking me. Was there a hidden agenda, an expressed agenda of, or was it even at that time even considered an agenda of imperialism if we're talking about Native Americans who were, any more than, homesteading or clearing this field of trees is imperialism, or thought of as imperialism? I mean,
go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I think you know where I'm going with this. I mean, was this a hidden agenda? Was it? I mean, where did the notion that we're not going to use this army to attack our own people. We're also not just going to use this army in the event that we're attacked. We're going to use this army to acquire things.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is the interesting thing about the context in which this debate was sort of taking place, is that it isn't taking place in the abstract, right? Like, as you say so rightly, it really wasn't a matter of like, let's just wait and see if we're attacked and make sure we have a good, strong army to defend ourselves. The nation was formed, things were ongoing all the time while the nation was being formed. And one of the things that was ongoing was an effort that had begun before the revolution, in fact, for an elite group of speculators in Western land to get a hold of that land with the purpose of making money. So all of these things are tied up together in ways that are quite complicated and affect trying to figure out to what extent there were agendas and to what extent those agendas were open in some cases or hidden in other cases. And how it lines up? Like, does everyone who was against the standing army, was everyone who was against the standing army sort of in favor of leaving the native people alone? No, they just thought that militias should take care of that job of securing the West. So it doesn't even break down anti-imperialist, anti-militarist necessarily. So your question goes to the heart, really, I think, of a number of fascinating issues that are bound up together in that moment of forming the nation, where we're already in the process, actually, of an imperial adventure. And it was open in the sense that Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, people on various sides of a lot of political issues all used the term empire in a very sort of admiring way to talk about what the national goals really were. So Jefferson might call it an empire for liberty or an empire of liberty, and Hamilton might think of it as more like an empire to compete financially with the British Empire. Washington definitely envisioned empire, and he meant the pursuit of development, real estate development, essentially, in the West. They all used the term empire. So in that sense, I would say it wasn't all that hidden. In another sense, though, when the arguments were taking place, when the debates were taking place, they were often taking place in a less than candid context, as politics being then as it is now. Everyone's not always saying what they really mean. And so there was this ongoing sort of struggle, which a lot of people didn't even want to call a war, which was to pacify, they would say, the West and be able to use that land and speculate in that land and make good on a lot of investment in that Western land. So your question goes to the heart of a very important. This is what I think is so important about this moment, actually, because we often think of imperialism as beginning sort of at the end of the 19th century, when we went sort of away from our natural boundaries and started expanding, beyond the continent. But of course, in fact, expansion beyond into the West, what was called the West then, expansion beyond the Ohio River, was a basic cause of. It was one of the causes of forming a nation, and had indeed been one of the causes of fighting the revolution. So that expansionist mentality was actually cooked very deeply into the original ideas of the Republican nation that this nation was becoming, even as it began.
I mean, I guess maybe the initial founders of the state, or those who landed on Plymouth Rock, were not necessarily seeking to expand, seeking out resources to ship across the ocean, but certainly the resources that followed were a function of that. And so, in some ways, I guess this sort of like this imperialist drive was inherited in some fashion.
Yeah, and again, that's very interesting. I mean, you're right that the book its main action focuses in the first half of the 1790s, but in order to sort of bring those impulses that I'm describing to life, you have to look a little further back. And in the book, I don't look all the way back to the immediate, to the absolute origin of, contact and first white settlement, but I do look back to the formation of what was called the Ohio Company of Virginia by a bunch of Virginia speculators who were George Washington's older brothers and their friends and family connections. And you do see this. I mean, some of it's regional, like Virginians were very interested in this, and many Pennsylvanians were very interested in this. And it's not as if New Englanders weren't interested, but a lot of the impulse behind this kind of expansionism seems to be the most successful, I should say, I guess, comes out of Virginians and Pennsylvanians. So, there were many, many different sort of contributing factors to original European settlement and appropriation of land on this continent. But one of those threads, and it's the thread that led, the reason it's important is it led very, maybe in a convoluted way, I was going to say very directly, maybe in a convoluted way, but nonetheless inexorably led toward the formation of a military nation state here. Comes out of this desire for speculation, land speculation, and land development west of the Ohio River, west of the Alleghenies, and then west of the Ohio River.
All right. Well, let's follow the money if we could. But before we do, why do you think Virginia and Pennsylvania? I mean, or is that have I asked the same two questions?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the things, you mentioned my earlier books when you were introducing me, much appreciated. One of them is called Declaration. And in writing this new book, Autumn of the Black Snake, I realized that I'd kind of blown an opportunity in Declaration to look at both the New England side and the Virginia side in more detail. I gave a lot of attention in that book to how New Englanders kind of overthrew the Pennsylvania government in an effort to bring about the Declaration of Independence. And I mentioned the collaboration with Virginia, which was very important, that New England and Virginia collaborated there. But I feel like the agendas there were somewhat different, and where a Samuel Adams, there were New Englanders who were, of course, invested in Western land, but where a Samuel Adams wanted to form a revived New England and a kind of what he called a Christian Sparta, and make a kind of virtuous, sort of almost back to the Puritan kind of mentality in New England, he was collaborating with Virginians who were really interested in something completely different, had no interest in a Christian Sparta, but were trying to get land policy in Virginia kind of into their own hands. And what drives those two things is a very interesting question. I mean, I'm not going to say that the New Englanders were free of their own forms of deep desire to get ahead. I mean, we know about John Hancock and the Hancock family, and actually the Adams family as well, the Samuel Adams family, and they were definitely business-oriented people trying to get ahead. This drive to the West, I think, comes partly out of understanding that tobacco, which did not, of course, become the king crop of America, but it looked, at the time, it was the king crop of America, that the Virginia tobacco planters in particular became aware that tobacco just destroys the soil in which it's grown. And they just knew that there was going to be an endless need for more and more new fertile land that hadn't been tapped for that kind of destruction. So I think that was one of the main impulses, and I think the Virginians just had an earlier sense of the potential, bonanzas to be made not only in tobacco, but in the land on which tobacco could someday be grown.
It's eerie to contemplate that sort of attitude towards tobacco by the tobacco producers at that time, because that attitude seemed pretty durable through history.
It's fascinating that way. Yes, it's true.
All right. Well, let's talk about let's follow some of that money. I mean, in terms of that argument about a standing army or not, those who are arguing for it, particularly Washington and Hamilton, they and I think you've sort of we've all nearly alluded to it, but had some interest in the idea of an expansive America.
Yeah, strong interest. And I don't think that, I mean, just from Hamilton's point of view, for example, since Hamilton is so talked about right now, I think it's important to keep in mind that his really comprehensive and very ambitious sort of vaulting vision of what the United States could be involved a kind of meeting between high finance, elite money yoked to national purposes, combined with expansion managed from the top down, federally managed expansion into those valuable areas, speculation in Western land and the development of Western land, combined with a strong, very strong military presence. So that was really like his vision was really kind of comprehensive in that way. And it's kind of how many people in the 18th century who were interested in nationhood, I think, would have conceived of just simply what a nation is, what a nation state would be. It would have, it would be a concentration of wealth yoked to a concentration of military power with a kind of expansionist, a kind of greater nationhood mentality. I mean, I don't think it makes the United States unique. It's just very interesting that there was also pushback against that idea. And it's also very interesting that you get into an issue around like, well, what are the legitimate boundaries of the United States when you're talking about indigenous people already living in those places where that speculation was going on. But certainly Hamilton's vision, and he was certainly not alone either. He was joined by Washington, who had a direct personal financial interest in that region, as did so many others of the elites in the founding generation. They really couldn't have imagined, I think, a United States pinned behind, east of the mountains, never to expand, never to grow. I think that would be almost unimaginable to them as a United States. So that was how they looked at it, and to get what they needed to do that, they had to have an army, and they had to actually conquer that area.
Well, I mean, when you lay out Hamilton's vision, it doesn't seem terribly different than what a monarch's country would look like at that time. I guess there's only the difference that theoretically there's more democracy in that, right? I guess, I mean, the difference would be in how they come to decide to arrive at that same sort of disposition.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, I think that's really interesting, the way to put it. I wouldn't say that Hamilton would have looked at, because we have a different kind of government here that is not a monarchical government or even a king in parliament as in the English government at that time or whatever, because we're not doing it that way, ergo we won't be expansionist. That was not an equation that would have made any sense to him, or many of the other people of his type who thought the way he did. It wouldn't necessarily in any way follow in the way Hamilton thought of these things, that because we have a republic, therefore we wouldn't be expansionist. And I think he had some good historical backup for that. I mean, this gets into some very interesting things that I think Americans argue about, today, which has to do with like what is legitimate, use of influence beyond your borders, and to what extent is it imperialist, and to what extent is it, or isn't it imperialist, and so forth. Because these guys, the founding generation, had as one of their examples, of course, the Roman Empire, and they were extremely immersed in classical reading. And those who were anti-imperialist sort of had an idea that that an emperor, a monarch type, is always going to want to be militaristic and expansive. And some had the idea, and I think we inherit this sort of delusion, that if you have a republican government, as in the earlier Roman government, the one that was pre-imperial, the sort of lean, mean, virtuous republic idea, that it's not an expansionist, that it doesn't have an expansionist or militaristic component. But that wasn't really true about Rome itself, let alone the United States. It's more like, you're always expanding. The question is, do you have a dictator at the top, or do you have a more Republican approach to who's running it? But expansionism doesn't live or die necessarily on whether there's an emperor or an elected government.
Well, I mean, was the perception that it's not expansionist if everybody agrees to do it? Or, I mean, how do you come to that reading of
I guess I would say this. I don't think I don't think you would call it not expansionist. You just wouldn't call it unrepublican to expand.
Right.
That's what I mean.
Right, okay.
And I think that's the way Rome. I mean, Rome did plenty of expanding during its Republican era too. I don't think they looked at it that way. I guess.
Were those who were concerned with a standing army? Did they have concerns? Did they have, and maybe they wouldn't have articulated it this way, an anti-imperialist perspective? Maybe it would have been more like if you have a standing army, at one point you run to the end of the ocean and then it starts turning back in on yourself, or what is it? What was the argument there? Was it just simply too similar to what the king had?
Yeah, well, the argument I think there would be, and this goes to your earlier point as well, the argument against the standing army, and the argument is that once you have one, it just tends, having one, if you have one, you're going to use it.
Right.
Would be one, and always in a state of war. I mean, this is the Republican sort of recoil from certain kinds of war making was based on the idea that if the more you're at war, the more likely you're going to give the executive power. I think this again goes into arguments that we've been having over the past 100 years and the past 20 years. I mean, once you're in a state of war, the executive is going to have more power. That's always the way things seem to work. So isn't there an incentive then on the part of the executive to be warlike? So that actually sometimes it's wagging the tail's wagging the dog. The executive is looking for war situations in order to increase executive power. Hamilton was directly accused of this kind of mentality when he was, and often rightly so. I think he was very drawn to the idea that war making increases power in the executive, and he liked both. He had a martial sort of attraction, and he also was very, very strong on a vigorous, powerful executive. So this was definitely part of the argument. It sometimes made some people, even, to go slightly against my earlier point, some people really were against expanding. Also, I should give them credit as well. There was also an anti-expansionist mentality, and even a pro-native mentality among some of the Eastern thinkers, that it was just wrong to go take these people's land. And also that it was wrong to just keep expanding, because expansionism leads to militarism, and militarism leads to more dictatorial kinds of power. So that mentality did exist. That kind of protest did exist.
Those were the early social justice warriors, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the people who were really abolitionists, like Quakers, for example, many of them were also very opposed to expanding into Indian territory. And there was a sort of a noble savage romanticism even among some people about how actually that the native people are more natural Republicans than we are. They're more democratic, and they're nobler and finer, and they don't seek to expand, and they don't seek to make war. And we should be more like them and not be taking their land. So those threads in our culture existed also right from the beginning.
So let's return to some of the history that you talk about. There's this massacre of American troops known as the St. Clair's defeat. Tell us what were the circumstances of that defeat? Was this a function of a half-hearted attempt to expand, or was it or what?
It was a full-on attempt to expand across the Ohio River, but it was half-hearted in its military effectiveness, because there was sort of an idea that the Washington administration had that we can just do this without actually bringing this argument to a total head. We can just sort of tell Congress, look, it's not going to take that much to do. It's sort of a simple mop-up. There's not that much opposition. We're just going to send a small force. We don't have to go crazy here. Just give us enough, and we'll do it quickly. And they were underrating, both for political reasons and also, I think, sincerely at the same time, underrating the degree of extreme opposition on the part of the indigenous people who lived there, and the degree to which they had become sophisticated, both politically and militarily, in their resolve to keep the United States back east of the Ohio River. So you used the term massacre, and I'm just going to dissent from that a little bit because it was a battle. Massacre tends to imply some kind of unfair, something, I don't know, sort of unfair, or a slaughter of innocents and so forth. But it was a battle in which the United States, it was the first battle that the United States as a nation ever fought. And it doesn't, there's a book about it by Colin Calloway called, I think, The Battle with No Name, or I forget the exact name of the, it's strange that it doesn't have a name, because it was the first battle the United States ever fought as a nation. And it was a total
Maybe
defeat.
that's why.
Yeah, exactly. That's my theory too. That's why we don't have a name for it, because the first battle we ever fought was an abject defeat, coming out of arrogance and poor discipline on the U.S. side, and excellent tactics and strategy and superb discipline on the native side. So that's called Sinclair. I mean, it does have I guess it does have a name. It's sometimes called Sinclair's defeat, but if you say that to most people, they've never heard of it. Just in terms of actual numbers of casualties, it puts like the Battle of the Little Bighorn much later and much better known. It makes it look like nothing. I mean, it was a massive victory. We call it a defeat, but actually the other way to look at it, of course, is that it was a thrilling victory on the part of the Native Confederation that achieved it. It was the bench. It was actually ended up being the high water mark of Native resistance to U.S. expansion westward, and yet still it isn't known or talked about much. So, which again is why I wanted to write this book. So
one would think that the results, right? I mean, if I guess they call this war the Mulligan. Was if it was sold in Washington as like, this is, don't worry about this, a little mop up type of situation, not a big deal. We got it. You know, this is such a tiny deal that we got this. You would think, intuitively, you would think like, oh, if they're massively defeated, this is going to make people gun shy, and they're going to say, we're just not going to engage in this type of stuff. But within a couple of years, we've got a standing army. What happens?
Well, one thing that happened is a lot of politics, a lot of sort of politics, junkie level politics. How the Washington administration turned this egregious defeat, or this thrilling victory from the Indian point of view, into a political wedge to actually get what they'd always wanted anyway. We have to keep in mind, because we were just talking about that. They always wanted a standing army anyway. It's one of these odd moments where, on the one hand, it was a horrible defeat and much life was lost. And Washington was sincerely, I believe, he had a total meltdown, a total temper tantrum when he heard about it. I believe he was sincerely shocked and horrified by the defeat. On the other hand, as so often happens in politics, and especially if you're a really tough, savvy politician, which Washington was, you can turn that around and turn it into a political victory. And yes, on the one hand, you'd think people would be gun shy. On the other hand, this was a terrifying moment of yes, defeat, but also it seemed like, well, what's going to happen next? I mean, all of the settlers out there are going to be killed, will be, to use the word, massacred. There won't be any defense out there. What are they going to do next? Are they going to come all the way to Pittsburgh, which was sort of the western frontier edge? Are they going to burn Pittsburgh down and kill everyone there? I mean, how far back is the frontier going to be pushed? This was, and people had family and friends living out there, trying to live out there. And then there was the development group, the owners really of a lot of that land, the speculators in that land, who thought of themselves as its owners, who were among the elites, who were deeply committed to defending those investments. And so there were a multitude of factors which I get into, but through some very adroit and tough politicking, the Washington administration pushed through Congress, partly by using public opinion, partly by manipulating Congress into situations in which it would just have looked politically inexpedient not to vote the way the administration wanted Congress to vote. I mean, good old American, politics. And I should add that in the administration at the time were Hamilton, of course, and also Jefferson, who we rightly see as bitter enemies, and they certainly did hate each other's guts at that time. However, they worked together as Washington subordinates on this project with Henry Knox as well to bring about the political machinations, some open and some back room, that got the Army bill passed through the House, and then Washington made some other deals with senators to get it through the Senate. And not very long after that horrible defeat, we did indeed have the first United States professional national United States Army.
I mean, I gotta say, as you're going through the varied agendas behind this, right? This pre-existing desire to have a standing army and all that implies, both from a defensive standpoint, but also from an expansive standpoint. The pre-existing financial incentives, and then the sort of like the ginning up. Arguably, maybe not ginning up, but it sounds like it, of fears of, if we don't get them there, we got to fight them here. I mean, it sounds very reminiscent of the buildup to the Iraq War, to probably many other of our conflicts, that this stuff is, I mean, is it that, and maybe I'm wrong in that assessment, and you'll tell me, but if I'm right, is it that these dynamics are basically eternal, or is it that these dynamics seem to be eternal, at least in the context of American history, because this was the pattern that we got in at the beginning?
Yeah, these dynamics are original in American history. I think that's a lesson of looking at this period and this war that nobody ever looks at, this first war we ever fought. Whether they're eternal, meaning like, are we going to be bound by such issues forever in the future because we began this way? I wouldn't want to say that.
Right. But I guess, did they were these
but
dynamics
I think you mean original,
existing in nature, or was it simply like, we got in, this is the way the country was founded? At a very, if we look at, there's a lot of things locked in for people around the ages of 3 or 4, and 5. And and it's as if like, this is what happened when we were in preschool and in kindergarten, and as adults we still function the same way as a nation.
Yeah, I do see this as sort of embryonic in that sense, and baked in pretty early. All the dynamics we're talking about, everything you just went through, that does seem to me so reminiscent of, or since we're going the other way, sort of potentially predictive of some of the issues around getting into Vietnam and some of the issues around getting into Iraq. A lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the combinations of it, as you've said, ginning up, which is absolutely was part of the tactic. People having pre-existing agendas, which then get fulfilled in conditions of crisis. Being able to sort of try to drag Congress kicking and screaming through a series of states of emergency, where it would just be politically inexpedient to vote against a certain resolution, say. All of those things. Obviously I'm reading the original history back through my knowledge of contemporary history, and one could say that I'm overreading it that way. But to just, so that would be an interesting argument to have. But I do think, to your point, that the things that we have gotten used to in some of our later wars are embryonic to this first war, and maybe more embryonic to this first war than some of the better known wars, which again goes back to the question of why have we forgotten about this war? Why isn't it part of our public discussion? And I think the reason is because possibly it's embryonic, and it reflects on later issues that we don't want to deal with either.
Those later issues being how we came about. I mean, it would have been one thing, right? I guess if we had a standing army because we were under attack versus
it's right.
We were going on attack.
Right. I mean, why do we go to war, and why do we like to think we go to war versus why do we actually go to war? For example, I mean, those kinds of issues. What is the rhetoric of war, of making war? why do we define certain wars as legitimate and others as maybe in retrospect illegitimate? How do we get around those objections, those protests, those dissents against going to war at the time that a certain element really wants to go to war? I think all of those things can be seen in this first war, which just makes it just continues to blow my mind that we just don't know about this war. But I think it's because it's so revealing of the bases of these problems that we have as a nation in trying to define what we think is a legitimate reason to fight a war.
Let me just ask you, as a historian, I mean, I think as someone who's not a historian and sort of, I think my relationship to history was fairly rudimentary as a if any. I don't think I had any relationship to history as a sort of a mode of thinking. And I mean, because as we talk about these dynamics that started with tobacco a couple hundred years ago, and it's almost as if these things, someone once told me about social work, that when you see a family that is incredibly dysfunctional, that you have to understand that's taken generations to get there, that these problems are sort of passed down from one interaction to another, parent to child, and then child grows up to be parent to their child, and they are directly implicated through the generations. I mean, are we looking? Is this story tell us that perhaps it's the same way? I mean, you could say that about the tobacco industry, that we understand we're going to run out of of places to grow, but we're also going to run out of consumers at one point. We've got to hide certain things, and if there isn't the same dynamic here that is resonating, not as sort of a distant example, but as one that is part of a continuum, and this sort of mentality, it worked then, the way they went about getting that standing army, and these practices are sort of passed down generation to generation.
Yeah, that's a very interesting set of thoughts. I mean, yeah, maybe. One way I guess I would think about that in terms of the story I'm telling here is one of the interesting things that I get into toward the end of the book, where I sort of try to look ahead after there's no suspense to the book. Ohio and Indiana and Illinois become part of the United States, as everybody knows. So after that has happened, then looking ahead to what happens to the standing army and what happens to the Midwest, which of course almost immediately becomes this incredible industrial driver of American empire, around the world. Which goes, I think, right to what you're talking about, this kind of generational development. One of the things that happens kind of early on in that is that, the Jefferson point of view, Jefferson was working with Hamilton and Knox and Washington to bring about this standing army, but he was always odd man out in this area, in the cabinet, in Washington's cabinet. And as we know, party politics begins right in the period that I'm talking about, and Jefferson very soon leaves the cabinet and becomes a member of the opposition party. And by the time everything's resolved in the story I'm telling, we begin to get pushback against the Federalist Party, partly because they were accused of being militarists. And once Washington was out of power and Hamilton was sort of trying to run everything from outside of power as well, the Federalist Party does become the military budgets just go through the roof, and it just suddenly, they don't have Washington to sort of, make it more politic, make it more palatable. They just seem like they're out of control. And really, to some extent, Hamilton tried to, was pushing for a war with France at that point, which didn't happen at that point. But that brought down the Federalist Party in a way, and Jefferson's party, as we know, came in. And the way Jefferson's party was presenting themselves, they were the anti-militaristic party at this point. And Jefferson, people looked at it as well, this is the real American Revolution. Now we're back on track. Those guys went crazy. They were tyrannical and militaristic, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you look at what happens next, of course, again, if you really, everyone already knows this, but if you put it in this context, it's rather striking that, it's really during the Jefferson era that the country really begins to expand westward, because, of course, it was Jefferson who made the Louisiana Purchase. And the Army, and there had to be a military presence further and further west. And Jefferson, too, wanted to, he's the one who actually starts talking about moving all of the recalcitrant native people across the Mississippi River. He put it in, literally, he said, for their own good. I think that's an exact quote. He didn't want to put it in such a harsh way, but in fact, the next sort of quote unquote generation of government in America, which was supposed to be much more lean, mean Republican, much less militaristic, it's really during the Jefferson administration that everything Washington and Hamilton and Knox fought for comes into its biggest fruition. And you could even jump a number of generations ahead and look at Teddy Roosevelt's era. And there's Roosevelt now looking offshore. He wanted to go to Cuba, and now we need the Philippines, and we need to get beyond the continent. And he looked back at the very war that I'm talking about, which has so since been forgotten in the public discussion. But Teddy Roosevelt was very keenly aware of the war that I'm writing about, and he saw it. I mean, he was openly and celebratorily claiming that this war, this Indian War, the first war the nation ever fought, the war for the Midwest, he was claiming it as a precedent for what he wanted to do. When people objected to what Roosevelt was trying to do, he said, "Why don't you just go talk to the Indians and tell them, give the land back? I mean, come on, this is what we do," he said. "Wake up, grow up. We've been doing it since day one." He had a realpolitik attitude toward it, and many of us have chosen instead to sort of forget what happened then. And we wouldn't want to adopt Roosevelt's point of view on it necessarily, of course. But the question then becomes, what do we do with it? What do we do with it? How do we want to construct it and contextualize where we come from? Because I think, to your larger point, I mean, the longer we don't look at these things, the more likely we are to exactly do what you're talking about, which is repeat and repeat and repeat in that same way you're talking about. Well, we've worked before, and now we'll try something else that's similar, and it'll work again in a different context, and we don't change. So that's kind of why I like to unearth this kind of stuff.
William Hogeland, the book is Autumn of the Black Snake, The Creation of the U.S. Army and the Invasion That Opened the West. Thank you so much for your time today. It's fascinating stuff.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a fun discussion.
A woman who is not a reporter, as far as I can tell, just an average American. And now I imagine it will come out that she's, I don't know, some paid operative for some right-wing outfit. It really doesn't matter. Oh, she does? Is she really? Is she a writer?
She's associate editor. For
she is? Yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't know, because it didn't sort of like, okay, yeah, or associate editor, because it was, I'm a conservative, and I went to an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rally. I would assume if you're writing in the Daily Caller, you're a conservative, but I guess this was more of like a clickbait type of thing. She writes that I went to a rally against the 7-term incumbent William Lacey Clay. Over the years, I have attended my share of political events. Tea Party protests, a Rick Perry speech on tax cuts.
Electrifying content.
A Ted Cruz rally, and even a speech given by President Donald Trump earlier this year. But nothing prepared me for the stark difference in tone. This sort of reads like a cross between like one of those like Playboy forums I remember. Like this, honestly.
The last thing I was expecting was to be seduced.
The last thing I was expecting at a Democratic Socialist meeting was to meet a hot Puerto Rican.
I'm no nerd, but I'm no nerd. I mean, I've been around, but the last thing I expected to hear from one even. Okay, here we go. Okay, so Ocasio-Cortez spoke, followed by Bush. That's the candidate. And I saw something truly terrifying. I saw just how easy it would be, were I less involved and less certain of our nation's founding and its history, to fall for the populist lines they were shouting from that stage. I saw how easy it would be, as a parent, to accept the idea that my children deserve health care and education.
Yeah, it's very, very easy to manipulate people with stuff like that.
I want this to I want this to marinate in your brain. That a parent just said, I saw how easy it would be as a parent to accept the idea that my children deserve health care and education.
Jesus.
I saw how easy it would be as someone who struggled to make ends meet to accept the idea that a, quote, living wage was a human right.
Sounds persuasive, doesn't it?
Above all, I saw how easy it would be to accept the notion that it was the government's job to make sure that those things were provided. I watched as both Ocasio-Cortez, and I should say, I didn't read this part because I wasn't sure about it earlier, but she talks about hearing all of these snippets of conversations, okay, that involved one person praising the strength and dedication of convicted cop killer Assata Shakur.
I'd also like to just co-sign. I would like to praise Assata Shakur, if I may. Thank you.
I mean, all these, whatever. Okay, it doesn't matter. All right, it's very, but whatever. I watched as both Ocasio-Cortez and Bush deftly chopped America up into demographics. Pointed out how those demographics had been victimized under the current system, and then promised to be the voice for those demographics. The movement, Ocasio-Cortez shouted, knows no zip code. It knows no state. It knows no race. It knows no gender. It knows no documented status. In other words, they cut it up into demographics, but then said, the movement's not about demographics. Bush, after saying her piece, noted she was careful to allow speakers from all across, all demographics. Why demographics? What the... To make it clear, she was not running to represent just one particular group, but all.
My demographics get it.
Lot of demographics.
I can't quite get my arms around whether she's saying that they contradicted themselves or that... Because that last sentence says, even though we've allowed speakers to talk about things from different demographics here, we represent everyone. How horrific. Now, as opposed to, let's say, that Ted Cruz rally where, we only have one broad demographic, normal white people, and that's it.
We have one demographic, and other demographics are going to need to quiet
I
down.
left the rally with a photo, in part to remind myself of that time I crashed a rally headlined by a socialist, but also in part to remind myself that there, but for the grace of God, go I. This is God. Listen, your kid does not deserve health care or the ability to eat. I'm sorry.
There's a lot of propaganda that, as an example, a kid who has leukemia but didn't work for his health care deserves treatment.
Please?
Don't get fooled by the old Jew or the young PR. Stay true.
Please. Believe me. Listen, it's God. I'm a guy. All right, so...
Why can't we use the word slut anymore? This is God.
Jezebels. So she, of course, got a ride onto, or a free ticket, I should say, onto Fox and Friends. And here she is. Was she on Fox and Friends? Oh, yeah, here she is on Fox and Friends, talking about the horror that she had witnessed the night before and where she would have gone but for the grace of God.
Conservative, and she went to one of her rallies. Daily Caller's Virginia Kruta, thank you so much for being with us. And you wrote an op-ed about it. Tell us why you went to her rally. What was the interest?
Thanks for having me. Well, I went kind of to see what the fuss was about, really, because, I've been to conservative rallies before. I've been to a Trump speech. I've been to a Ted Cruz rally when he was running for president. And I just kind of wanted to see, why the message was resonating, because really the socialist message is gaining steam within the Democrat Party.
So based upon what you saw, why are people drawn to this message?
Well, I was listening to them talk, to Ocasio-Cortez and also to Cori Bush, who she was stumping for in St. Louis. And they say things I mean, they talk about things that everybody wants, especially like if you're a parent. They talk about education for your kids, health care for your kids, the things that you want. And, you know, if you're not really paying attention to how they're going to pay for it or, you know, the rest of that, it's easy to fall into that trap and say, my kids deserve this. And, you know, well, maybe the government should be responsible for helping me with that.
Mm-hmm. Virginia, as a conservative, when you're sitting in that...
Pause it for 1 second. I mean, does it feel like as she's even saying these words out of her mouth that she's about to go, hey, wait a second.
Virginia, as a sociopath, how do you respond to the basic human sentiment that children shouldn't starve and people should have health care? This is pretty easy for people to fall into.
I like how she says, like, but they don't talk about how you're going to pay for it or any of that.
You can kind of see the gears turning in her mind right now.
Right? Like, she's just going like, God, it would be nice if my kids could get health care. Continue.
For your kids, health care for your kids, the things that you want. And, you know, if you're not really paying attention to how they're going to pay for it or, you know, the rest of that, it's easy to fall into that trap and say, my kids deserve this. And, you know, well, maybe the government should be responsible for helping me with that.
Mm-hmm. Virginia, as a conservative, when you're sitting in that audience or standing in that audience and you're listening to that message, how did it make you feel? Were you angry? Were you more drawn to that?
I was mostly uncomfortable because I was surrounded by a group of people who were talking about how they had gotten involved because they were tired of being angry all the time. And it seems like so much effort to be angry about everything instead of to focus on what you could do to change it.
I didn't get the last part. That was very confusing.
Just say that?
Yeah,
there were people at a political rally to support candidates who were going to go out and change things. And they said that they were there because they were tired of being angry. And I just think it's weird that you would be angry and not go out and do something to support it.
She's really phoning it in here.
No kidding.
Like, if I didn't know better, I'd think she were a plant from the DSA.
I mean, it's possible. Or I think it's possible we're watching sort of like a slow rolling
awakening.
Sort of like an awakening / nervous breakdown. I think that's possible.
It reminds me of how Dave Rubin talks about how the left is so negative.
Right.
She goes to a Bernie or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez thing and gets the exact opposite impression.
Especially, and then maybe when Tucker's like, "You're fired and you don't have health care anymore." Maybe that will be the next lesson.
Right.
For her
exactly.
In her ongoing nervous
breakdown.
Now,
this notion of conservatives being afraid that the left in some way offers some vision that is like too sugary and too the trap here is that it actually sounds great, is an old construct. In fact, back in FUBAR, the book that Stephen Sherrill and I wrote back in 2006,
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, well, we had a clip. Let's put that clip up there. Not a clip, a story about a guy named Dr. Paul Cameron. He was the founder of the Family Research Institute and the unfortunately named ISIS, which was the Institute for the Scientific Investigation of Sexuality. This is a real...
I think ISIS might actually have something that's similarly named and programmed.
Right. He was a huge figure in the right's attempt to marginalize LGBT people. And this is a clip of something that he wrote. This is from I think it might be an interview that Robert Dreyfuss did with him back in 1999. If you isolate sexuality as something solely for one's own personal amusement, and all you want is the most satisfying orgasm you can get, and that's what homosexuality seems to be, then homosexuality seems too powerful to resist. The evidence is that men do a better job on men, and women, I'm not clear where this evidence lies, but it's possible.
He's reviewed the evidence, okay? He's seen a lot of documentaries about this.
And women on women, if all you're looking for is orgasm. I'm convinced that lesbians are particularly good seducers. It's pure sexuality. It's almost like pure heroin. It's such a rush. They are committed in almost a religious way. As opposed to the religious people committed in a religious way.
So this guy was like literally soliciting small-scale donations to watch porn all day?
And they'll take enormous risks, do anything. Marital sex tends toward the boring end. Generally, it doesn't deliver the kind of sheer sexual pleasure that homosexual sex does.
The era of the pajama boy is over.
I think in the book we said our apologies to Mrs. Dr. Cameron. But that's the whole story here, right? Like, the problem with the idea, as a parent, you're susceptible to this message that your kid deserves health care and an education. And it's so alluring that you will actually maybe sign up to have your kid get health care and an education. And then your kid will have health care and an education.
Part of me wishes I was still religious so I could tell that woman that she's probably listening to Satan when he leads her away from this. Like, there but for the grace of God, go out. That's not God.
Oh, that's Satan. Well, there you have it, folks. The Daily Caller. But you know what's awesome about that story? Is it is the most clicked story, I would bet, on Daily Caller, probably for the week. And so they're going to do more of these. Like, I went to an AOC rally, and she promised that people would get the opportunity to go to college for free.
And let's not shy away from this. Not only do they deserve college, they deserve pure heroin orgasms. We're not going to shy away from it anymore. Pure gay heroin, pure, not stepped on, straight from the poppy fields of Pakistan.
That'd be a good slogan. Yeah. Pure heroin orgasms.
Pure heroin orgasms. Okay, look, in my opinion, you go to Denmark, there's a lot more pure heroin orgasms, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have that here.
All right, look.
We were playing with this last night on the TMBS postgame because Jordan Peterson actually said recently that this was a really amazing piece of work.
Actually, we should maybe play that.
Yeah, let's just play that. Why not?
Okay,
let's just give them the full entree here. A little bit of double dips today, but this stuff is too good to not do. So let's play Jordan Peterson talking to a very dumb Steven Crowder.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson can set up this video clip for us, actually.
Jordan Peterson, exactly.
Gig. Hey, Dr. Peterson, the original reason we were going to have you on, we didn't know we were going to have Lindsay on, was you had seen also the Alexa video and had some strong opinions and reached out, and that sort of caught fire with this controversy. First off, it was meant to be sort of artificial intelligence, a discussion on that when we brought the video out, right, not gay Jared? And then it became about a conspiracy about faking an Alexa video, which people ran with.
Which we simply had no time to do.
Yeah, which we had no time to do. It was verifiably
from the talent.
What was that?
Or maybe even the talent.
Yes. So I know you reached out, and you this is something you've kind of talked about for a while. What's your take on this?
Beware of what kind of unconscious you build into your artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's an important point.
And it's really, and we're really going to be. I really thought that your video was a kind of watershed moment in some sense, because it's the first example I've seen of a human-robot interaction of that sort that produced that kind of politically charged statement.
Okay, so this is pretty heady stuff from a person that has been identified as the most important public intellectual in the Western world. Let's go back into the time tunnel, let's go back in time.
We went back to this watershed moment.
Let's go back to this watershed moment in not only broadcast history, but actually the relationship between the human subconscious and technology.
Alexa, what is communism?
Communism, an economic or political system based on the sharing of all working property by the whole community.
Alexa, what is socialism?
Socialism, the Marxist-Leninist economic system.
I That's not right at all.
No,
there's socialism.
That's wrong.
There's socialism that predated Marx, and there's socialisms that emerged
Yeah.
independent of it.
Right.
Yeah, don't you know anything, Alexa?
Yeah, that is
Alexa,
not.
what is Marxism?
Marxism is a socio-economic method that analyzes class relations and societal conflict using a materialist interpretation of historical development and a dialectical view of social transformation.
Pause it. I was going to say that Alexa nailed that one. That is a textbook. She just spat knowledge.
I might crib that one.
Yeah.
It probably helps that she has instant access to Google.
Yeah, exactly. That's
well, there's going to be a little bit of a theme
they
about
tiptoe around that.
What Google may or may not be doing here, and how these guys may or may not understand the most basics, not only really of technology, but literally the algorithms upon which their whole silly business even rests on.
Social transformation.
So it basically just said communism is socialism. Socialism is the incorporation of Marxism. And then Marxism was... So it effectively...
Concedes
that they are all the same thing.
All the same thing.
Wow.
No.
Point proved, apparently.
Wow.
That's good enough for Crowder.
That's okay. Sure.
Alexa, what is fascism?
Fascism is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism, characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce that came to prominence in early 20th century Europe.
It seems that there's a much more negative view of fascism than communism.
It would seem that she has some stronger opinions there.
It seems that she was,
about
I only
fascism.
say what I know. Communism is beautiful in theory. It just hasn't been implemented correctly yet. She's a little commie. Alexa, who was Joseph Stalin?
Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin was a Georgian-born Soviet revolutionary and political leader.
Pause it. I will say that is a pretty chill read on Stalin. I'm going to have to give him at least the tip of the hat there.
Well, she's not wrong.
She's not wrong, but that might not be what you lead with.
She kind of skipped over the part where you murdered a lot of people.
Alexa,
Well,
how
also,
many people did...
I mean, on the flip, she also skipped over the part where he was instrumental in defeating Nazism and winning World War II. Like, she basically...
I'm down for including both of them.
Yeah, I'm down for, let's include that he was a absolutely vicious mass murderer, probably potentially even in his own personal life, and that without his Soviet army and his cunning, after previously forming a fascist alliance with Hitler, we would not have defeated Nazism. And an endless amount of Russians died in that effort. And they never get any credit. It's totally unfair.
Alexa, how many people did Joseph Stalin kill?
Joseph Stalin is a killer of 41,500,000 people.
Seems like you would lead with that.
It seems like that should be included. Alexa, who were the Nazis?
Historically, Nazis were those who followed the far-right ideology of Adolf Hitler, with political beliefs involving the superiority of the Aryan race.
Crowder's eyebrows go up when they say far right.
Right. What do these morons want? See, this is where these guys are so fucking stupid, because what they want apparently is there can be no complexity or reality in a discussion of socialism or Marxism. That just has to be all it is Stalin killed a lot of people. There's no intellectual tradition. There's no Fabian socialism, no Christian socialism. And to be fair, I'm sure that Steven Crowder has no idea what any of those things I just mentioned are. He's a dumb guy. But at least I understand what they're whining and beefing about with the socialism and Marxism thing, because why are you describing other things? It should just be the body counts, okay? That's what they're saying. It should just be the black book of communism, which had some methodological problems, by the way, as a book. But what do they want the complication around fascism to be? Do they want it to be that, like, Nazism was a cool idea about Germans feeling better about themselves and hiking in the Alps, but unfortunately some bad things happened?
They built some good interstates and pioneered some missile technology.
So is he doing that, or is he doing the ultimate moron Dinesh D'Souza, Don Jr., Jonah Goldberg chestnut, which is that the Nazis were also leftists? Is that where we're going? Okay.
Historically, Nazis were those who followed the far-right ideology of Adolf Hitler, with political beliefs involving the superiority of the Aryan race, the right of German territorial expansion, and the exclusion and eventual extermination of unfit peoples from the population. In modern times, neo-Nazi ideology still advocates hyper-nationalism and racial purity.
Alexa, what does Nazi stand for?
C is an abbreviation of cytosine.
Alexa, what does Nazi stand for?
Not is defined as unary logical function not. True if input is false.
Alexa, what does Nazi mean?
The word Nazi has a few different meanings. As an adjective, 1. Relating to or consistent with or typical of the ideology and practice of Nazism or the Nazis.
Alexa, who was the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party?
Here's something I found on Wikipedia. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly referred to in English as the Nazi Party,
there we
was
go.
a far-right
Thank you.
political party.
Alexa, no more.
Well, thanks for the feedback.
Alexa.
She owned him.
Okay, now this is just the last one that I think this is maybe the most revealing question they ask and the way their reactions are to it. Here we go.
Okay.
So, what is Black Lives Matter?
Oh, God.
Black Lives Matter is an international activist movement originating in the African American community that campaigns against violence and systemic racism towards black people.
Pause it. Alexa is she's pretty historically informed and kind of woke. All right, let's keep.
Black Lives Matter is an international activist movement originating in the African American community that campaigns against violence and systemic racism towards black people.
Alexa, how many Black Lives Matter activists have stolen you?
Sorry, I don't know that one.
It's because they wiped your memory.
God. That's so racist. Not to state the obvious, but God.
I feel like that is actually the laugh for that.
It's amazing to me that they are so assured that everyone's going to have that reaction to that answer about Black Lives Matter, right? Can you believe they say they're against police violence?
What? You mean a standard definition about people working so that their children, brothers and sisters and fathers and husbands aren't murdered in the streets as we see almost literally every day? It's ridiculous.
I've got a clip here.
What about George Soros-funded ultra-nationalist anti-white plot to kill white people like they're doing in South Africa, Alexa?
Well, this is why comedy is so contingent upon the society in which it's produced, the people, the place, because, I don't know, 50 years ago, the majority of people would have thought that his joke was funny. And now the majority of people understand that joke is racist, and only racists think that joke is funny.
Yep, meaning is socially constructed. I have a clip here from Volker Ulrich's Hitler, Ascent, 1889-1939. This talks about his relationship to Marxism.
Tell me more.
Wow. I think you just literally
included both the Social Democrats and the Communists. But because the moderate Hamburg SPD, which cooperated with bourgeois liberals, was not a suitable target for attack, Hitler concentrated his bile on the KPD, whose leader, Ernst Thälmann, came from the northern German port city. Hitler deliberately called upon the fears of his audience, which included leading Hamburg merchants, of the communists coming to power. If communism were to triumph today, 2 million people would be making their way to the gallows, he prophesied. But there was a way of smashing and eradicating the Marxist worldview, which was the aim of his own movement. The NSDAP, Hitler proclaimed, knew that toxins could only be combated with antitoxins, and the party would not rest until the last Marxist has either been converted or eliminated. The initially reserved audience greeted these words with frenetic applause, and at the end of the speech, when Hitler proclaimed his vision of a Germany of freedom and power, he was showered with ovations and shouts of Heil.
There's your leftist Nazis, Steven Crowder, you idiot.
Alexa, idiot. Who was that? Alexa, who was being quoted?
Yeah, Matt, but do you remember what Nazis stand for?
Oh, shit, I forgot about that. I don't know.
I mean, I guess socialist is in the name, but Guess that does mean anything.
I don't know if Volker Ehrlich or Ulrich addressed that, but that is a pretty...
Volker Ehrlich? Was he in Metallica?
It's textbook fascist shit to take words that people like and appropriate them. And concepts that people like. Like, that's what they're doing now with liberal shit.
J.R. Bolsonaro's party that he is running on is called the Social Liberal Party. And he's literally a fascist who's called for, who's said that the military dictatorship didn't torture and murder enough people when it ran Brazil. Now, again, I have no doubt that Steven Crowder does not know who Jair Bolsonaro is.
Because Steven Crowder's a dumb person.
Yeah, Steven Crowder's a very stupid guy, so I'm trying to be fair here. So maybe, unless, the Koch brothers or whoever else sent him an email and said, you need to know who Jair Bolsonaro is, you dumb little prick, because that's who we're going to install in Brazil to torture the indigenous people. He has no idea who he is otherwise, because he's a stupid, uninformed person. He might not. I'm not even clear that Steven Crowder knows what Brazil is. Certainly not that it's Portuguese.
Let's go to a 509 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Samuel Cedar, I presume.
Yes.
Long-time listener, first-time caller from the Hall of Presidents in sunny Orlando, Florida.
Wow.
At Disney Resorts. 'Tis I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Oh, well, hello, Franklin Delano.
Samuel,
yes.
Yesterday I tuned in to your show late and could hear you were quite distraught about something, but I did not hear the news. Tell me, was there a collapse of the global markets, leaving tens of millions of Americans homeless, jobless, and scrapping for their next meal?
No, not...
Did the Japanese engage in a surprise attack? And believe me, it was a complete surprise, which resulted in thousands of dead Americans while plunging us into a bloody global war over the future of civilization?
No, it was...
And tell me, Samuel, do your legs still work?
They do, yes. Barely.
Then pull yourself together, for Christ's sake. In my day, when they tried to own the libs, I lined up all the Republicans in Congress, shoulder to shoulder, and had Eleanor push my chair down the line while I whipped each of them square in the balls with my cane. Yes, they did everything they could to stop my greatest accomplishments, like, say, I don't know, a little thing you may have heard of. What's it called? Social fucking security?
Right, I've heard of that. That's one of my favorites.
Yes. Yes, Sam, things are bleak. And now you've had your day to mourn, to wander the streets of New York like a sad, pathetic dog with your tail between your legs. But today you sharpen your shiv because you're in a motherfucking prison yard fight, Sam. Now go bury that toothbrush handle in the jugular of the biggest, meanest man in the clink. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Yes. Well, I appreciate that.
Now I must jump, as they say, before the more troubling parts of my legacy get brought up, like the Japanese internment camps, my treatment of the Negroes, or that time I fucked my cousin.
Thank you. Wow.
The more you know.
Yeah.
That was very edutaining.
That, yeah, I got, it was not a New York area code, too. That was the odd part. Or a Florida one.
He might be down taking the Springs.
That's right. Well, I mean, he is from the Hall of Presidents. I mean, as far as we know, he is dead. Calling from a 208 area code.